What I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about some of the ideas that I've been thinking about recently. And in some ways, what I really want to do is get at a really big idea, what I think is a really big idea, which is this question of how it is that we're so smart, given that we're made of bits that are so dumb. I mean, we have these neurons, and right now you're sitting there with these neurons in your head, and basically all a neuron does is it either fires or it doesn't. It's either on or it's off. In and of itself, and in any individual neuron, or even a bunch of them, really isn't that smart. But what's true about humans, of course, is that with some exceptions, and you can fill in the blank yourself, we're pretty smart. We do some pretty amazing things, and somehow the meat in your head makes us all able to do really incredible things, like digest information in talks like this one and other ones in the Zocalo series. And what I want to do first is give you an answer to the question of how you can get something so smart from bits that are so dumb. I want to give you a really bad answer. And the bad answer takes me back to my first job out of college, which is at Walt Disney World. Very few people know this, so now this is a little secret, just me and you, so don't tell anyone. I worked at Walt Disney World on an attraction called Cranium Command. And the bit was as follows. So when you go to Cranium Command, you find out that there's these little guys called Cranium Commandos, and in particular, the star of the show is a little guy named Buzzy. He's really small, even for a Cranium Commando, and they're already pretty small. And what they do is they go inside other people's brains, and they have a little control chair, a little bit like Captain Kirk does, with buttons and levers and so on. And he runs the show. So he gets information from the hypothalamus, and he gets information from different, the adrenal gland, played by Bobcat Goldthwait, who the younger people in this audience might not remember, but those of us a little older do. And he makes a great adrenal gland. And so what he does is he sits around in his chair. This is Buzzy now, not Bobcat, and he runs the show, right? So he's controlling the action. He sees what the person he's in sees, a guy named Bobby, and he runs the show. And it's a really great attraction. It's unfortunately dark right now. I can say dark since I'm in Los Angeles and everyone knows what that means. It's not operational right now because of the sponsorship, but it was a great attraction. And what's definitely true about the attraction is that it's got to be wrong about the way your mind works. You don't get smart by putting a really, really smart thing inside the brain, right? In some ways, what this does is it invites the question, well, wait a minute. If Buzzy, the smart guy, is running the show, who's running Buzzy? Right? So who's the even smaller Cranium Commando inside Buzzy's brain? And what that means is that the answer to the question, how do you get a brain to be smart, can't be to posit some kind of smart thing in the middle that does it all. And that leads us to what the right answer to the question is, which is that you get smart things like brains by building together lots of less smart pieces. And the way that I illustrate this is an example that's familiar, I'm sure, to all of you in the room, which is a smartphone. If you think about the transition from phones to smartphones, what made them better was not that they were better at transmitting information along a wire. In fact, I had a phone call today. The call dropped 3 times. If anything, in some ways, phone conversations are worse than they used to be. But what makes a smartphone smart is that in addition to enabling you to make a phone call, it does a ton of other useful things. You can check your stock portfolio. You can check a map. You can find out where you are. You can identify local restaurants and so on. If you look at the screen of a smartphone or the multiple screens of smartphones now, they have all these little applications. And it's all these different applications that work together that make smartphones smart. Smartphones are not smart because they're great phones. They're smart because they do lots of different things. And my argument is that this is the right way to think about the human mind, about your mind. The human mind bundles together lots of different, not applications, but what I, as an evolutionary biologist, if I were one, would call adaptations. Parts of the mind that are designed to bring about outcomes, that have jobs. So just like a smartphone has a job of, for example, giving you the weather, giving you the news, identifying where you are in space, your mind has lots of jobs too. So you have a visual system that's responsible for taking information from the world and building it up into a representation of the world around you. You have an auditory system. You have memory systems, which are responsible for remembering specific words or ideas or events that have occurred. And most importantly, for the material that I'm going to get to by the end, which is about hypocrisy, is going to be that there are all these different parts of your head that are discharging social functions. You have parts of your mind that are particularly good at doing things like building friendship, delivering benefits to offspring and kin, to detecting cheaters, to building preferences about who would be an appropriate mate. And what I want to say is that you can understand how you get the inconsistencies in human behavior by thinking about what happens when you get something to be smart by virtue of pulling together lots of things which are by themselves relatively simple or a little bit dumber, that have little components, each of which has a job, living next to other components that have jobs. We call these parts of the mind, the things with little jobs, what I call them are modules, following the tradition in cognitive science. A module is just a way to talk about some device that has a narrow function. So the example I like to use is a photoreceptor. As you're sitting there, all of you have many, many cells in the retinas of your eyes, and all they do is sit around all day and check to see if electromagnetic radiation, light, is hitting them in a particular wavelength. And if the wavelength hits them, then they say, okay, I just saw some photon, and if it doesn't, they just sit there and do nothing. And that's all that these guys do, right? Their job is incredibly narrow. And what I want to argue is that that kind of architecture, specialized systems doing little things, when you bundle them all together, is what makes people really, really smart. But it also has some really interesting consequences. I'm going to try and do something which I've never tried before, which is to do an optical illusion with no optics. So I want you to all imagine that you're in a bar and you want to show this trick to a friend of yours. And so what you do is you take out a pen and you write two parallel lines on a napkin. And so you make sure they're really equal in length. Okay? On the top one, you have arrows that are facing outward. And on the bottom one, you have arrows facing inward. And this should ring a bell for some of you who've taken intra-psych courses. This is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. And when you do that, you'll find that the line that has the arrows that are facing outward looks a little bit shorter than the line that's facing outward, right? Now, it'll appear as though they're different sizes, but you just made the lines yourself. And so you know for sure that they're equal in length. So what that means is that one part of your head, the visual system, which gets confused by illusions like this, has a belief, if you will, that the lines are unequal in length, right? So the only way that they could appear unequal is if some part of your head perceived them that way. And yet a different part of your head has a factual representation that they're the same. What this means, and this is going to set up all the interesting parts of human inconsistency, is that the same idea in your head can be represented along with its contradiction. So you can have two contradictory representations, and by that I just mean pieces of information, in one head at exactly the same time. And that's actually kind of an exciting thing about brains, which is that they can have contradictions within them by virtue of the fact that they consist of these little pieces. And that leads to all sorts of interesting things. Here's one. A study done in the late 70s by two authors, Nisbet and Wilson, asked people to look at 4 pairs of pantyhose on a table outside of a mall. And the experimenters simply asked people to identify which one they liked the best. What people didn't know is that before the experimenters had randomly shuffled the 4 pairs of identical pantyhose and just laid them out on the table and let people pick which one was which. So they were all exactly the same. For the most part, what people did is when they were asked to answer this question, they pointed to one, and it was usually the one all the way on the right side of the table. We don't really know why people like the one on the right side of the table, but people do. But what is interesting about this is if you ask people why they picked that one, what happens is that people will just sort of make something up. Well, that one, I like the color on that one. Well, the texture on that is a little bit better than the other ones. Well, that one looks like it would fit better. But we know that they're all identical. So basically what's happening is that people are just making up an answer. And the reason that's happening is for the same reason that you see in the optical illusion. One part of the person's mind is causing the decision making to occur, pointing to the pantyhose. And another part of the mind, the one that talks, has to justify it. And it doesn't have access to that other piece of information. It doesn't know that it shows the pantyhose on the right simply because it was on the right. So it just makes up a story. This has, as I said, all sorts of interesting implications, and there are all kinds of examples in which information in one part of your head doesn't move to the information in another part of your head. Where you have these inconsistencies, you have ignorance, and so on. And what I've been doing with some of my work is thinking about how we can identify the different properties of these modular systems, particularly in the context of social behavior. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit of a story about crossing the street in Philadelphia and Los Angeles. So as I said, I'm on sabbatical, and I usually live in Philadelphia. And here's the way you cross the street in Philadelphia. The most important thing, if traffic is coming from that from your right, is to look straight forward. You can check out your iPhone or something else and walk straight out into your intersection. By the way, don't try this at home. This is just for the bit. I don't want any liability issues creeping up here, but you can do this. So if the cars are off to your right, keep your head forward. Make sure they don't see you, because here's what happens when drivers in Philadelphia, if they see that you have seen that they're coming, then they figure, well, he knows how to escape. He'll do it, right? But if you keep your head facing this way, and you show that you're ignorant of the impending doom of the car barreling through the intersection, most of the time they'll stop. What this means is that ignorance can be a weapon in social interactions, right? So if I don't know something, I'm actually better off. And so what I'm going to argue, and this is going to be a crucial part of my argument, is that some of your modules, some of the parts of your head, are actually designed to be ignorant. It's actually useful not to know stuff, in the context specifically of social interactions. But let me contrast that. I want to be very careful about this. There are other senses in which ignorance is not going to be helpful. Again, just looking out at the audience, it looks like many, or if not most of you, probably at least might remember the video game Frogger. This was an important part of my childhood. In the video game, you control a little frog, and he's got to go across many lanes of traffic, just like crossing the street in Philadelphia. But here's the thing about Frogger. If you're playing Frogger, and you're about to go into traffic, it absolutely doesn't help you not to look to see if the cars are coming. Because when you're playing a game against nature, in this case against a machine, ignorance can't be an advantage. Ignorance can only help you in the context of interactions with other people, not with the world. This is a really important distinction, because what we're going to see is that some modular systems can be expected to exploit the value of ignorance, and others should be expected not to. Let me give you an example from the real world. I can use these allusions to the media out here, since again I'm in Los Angeles. So I want to talk about the West Wing. On the East Coast, that would mean, of course, the West Wing. The place here, I mean the television series, which was popular for quite a while. So in the West Wing, there's this wonderful sequence with the press secretary, Will Bailey, the second one, for those of you who are aficionados, not C.J. Craig, where he's talking about the advantages when he's being a press secretary of ignorance. He says, I do my best work when I'm the least informed person in the room. And the idea there is that as a press secretary, if I have information that's potentially damaging and someone asks me about it, I have the awkward problem of either divulging the awkward information, right, in which case now the information is out there, or denying that I have it, in which case now I'm potentially subject to all the possible penalties of lying as a press secretary. So I'm actually better off under certain circumstances as a press secretary when I don't know stuff. The crucial thing for the mind, and this is what I want to argue, is that you can think of all of you as having as one important part of your modular system, press secretaries. These are modular systems that interact with the world, and what I want to say is that under certain circumstances, they can actually be better off being either ignorant or wrong. That there is value in error because you have press secretary modules in your mind. So let me just give you an example of some cases in which we know the people are wrong. There's a really well-known study in which college instructors were asked how good an instructor they were. And the statistic is that 94% of college instructors, people like me, rate themselves as above average teachers. 68% rank themselves in the top quarter. I rank myself in the top quarter, but I happen to be right about this, of course. The question is why? Why is it that people are wrong in this way, right? And you've probably seen stuff about this, how we are self-deceived or we are unrealistically optimistic. And one of the things that I've been doing is cataloging all these sorts of cases. And some of the studies about this are as funny as that particular statistic. I just want to give you two different kinds of answers to that question, why we're wrong about these things. And one of them is sort of an answer that relies on this notion of modularity, and one of them is the answer that everyone in my discipline except for me seems to think is right, and I'll start with that one. So here's the kind of the intuitive answer. The intuitive answer is, Rob thinks he's a great teacher because Rob likes to feel good about himself. And if he thinks he's a great teacher, he feels better about himself. So that's why he's wrong about this stuff. So this is an answer that sort of turns on this intuitive notion, which is big out here in California, of self-esteem, right? Self-esteem is everything. How does Rob build his self-esteem? Well, he thinks he's a great teacher. He thinks all these sort of great things are going to happen to him and so on. What I want to argue is that there's a couple of different problems with that style of answer. And the main one that I want to get at is the following. When you think about the modules that are in your head, the only reason you have those modules are by virtue of evolution, is because these modules have jobs that are good at accomplishing goals which are relevant to reproductive success. So you can see the world because you got to figure out how to move around the world, not run into a tree and fall off a cliff and so on, right? You have a memory because you have to remember who did what to you last time so you can do unto them as they did unto you last time, right? Same thing for the social. You have friendship systems to build friendship networks so that if a fight breaks out, you have people who will support you in the context of that conflict. You have mechanisms which are designed to find other people attractive if they're of the appropriate age and sex and so on, by virtue of the fact that individuals without those systems didn't make good mating choices. The argument that your modules are designed to make you happy from an evolutionary point of view doesn't lead to any kind of reproductive success in and of itself, and therefore is unlikely to be the case. Now, it could be that these modules happen to make you happy for some other reason, by virtue of the fact that they're doing whatever their job is. But the modules themselves are not designed, so you can't have one module whose job it is to make another module happy, right? Because from the standpoint of evolution, that's not a job at all. The only jobs natural selection will cause to come into existence are the ones that lead to outcomes in the world out there. I mentioned that there's a second problem with the self-esteem argument, which is that there has been just an incredibly broad industry of research looking at self-esteem, trying to show how important the quest for self-esteem is and how many effects it has on various kinds of psychological outcomes. And to a first approximation, despite decades of research in self-esteem and millions of dollars, the effects in this literature are very close to zero. That just as an empirical matter, it doesn't look like if you're going to try to explain people's behavior, you're going to want self-esteem in there as your causal variable. But instead, here's what I want to argue. This is the style of argument that I think is useful in thinking about why it is that you're wrong about all of your traits. By the way, I'm sure all of you have just absolutely wonderful traits. I'm not trying to say that you're not. Just as on this note, as I was driving here, I was thinking about some of this research on drivers, which is very salient here in LA. They did a little study a number of years ago where they took 50 randomly selected people, and they took 50 people who were in the hospital by virtue of the fact that they'd just been in a car accident. And they just said, how good a driver are you? And they just measured the two, and there is no statistical difference between those two groups. So literally crashing into cold, hard reality and other people is not enough to make you think that, in fact, you might not be the best driver on the planet. Anyway, so what I want to say is something that really goes all the way back to William James, which is about self-fulfilling prophecies, which is, the argument goes like this. When you're trying to figure out what I'm like, one of the best pieces of information you have about me is what I say and what I do. So if I behave as though I'm one of these instructors who's in the top quartile of all possible instructors, if I behave as though I'm a high status guy and so on, you make inferences about my value, positive inferences about them. And so, of course, I'm not trying to argue here that that people are dissembling or lying. What I'm trying to say is that in the world, things are ambiguous. Usually you don't get into car accidents. So if I said, I'm in the 80th percentile of drivers, maybe you would believe me. And I'm not even saying that in the sense that I'm not sincere about it. I might say that being sincere, thinking that I'm among them, and particularly because it's hard to say, what does it mean to be a good driver? Is it someone who obeys the traffic laws? Is it someone who doesn't get into an accident despite not obeying the traffic laws? Is it someone who can do a bootlegger at 80 miles an hour? Right? So these things are ambiguous. My point is that if you believe that there are some modules whose job it is to project the most positive image of yourself that you can, to to persuade other individuals that you have valuable qualities that make you a good friend, associate, team member, and so on, then these modular systems might be wrong and ignorant in exactly the same way that we talked about in the context of crossing the street in Philadelphia. If I don't know something bad about myself, and when I say I, talking about this stuff gets a little bit awkward because one of the arguments I want to make is that when you use words like I, me, the self, and so on, you're talking about a modular system, and so there's actually no there. I don't actually think it makes sense in psychology to keep talking about I and the self because you're all little subsystems, and that makes conversations like this tricky. But what I'm trying to say is that the press secretary system in my head can give me an advantage if it's ignorant about facts which would be damaging if they leaked out. That's the crucial thing. In the same way that crossing the street in Philadelphia can be dangerous if you have knowledge about who's coming and other people know that fact, having information about your own negative qualities can actually be damaging in the social world. And so what I'm going to argue here is that there are cases in which ignorance and to some extent error can actually be an advantage. So to sort of sum to this point, what I'm trying to say is that you have all these different systems in your head, and some of them give you an advantage by being wrong or ignorant, and they are coexisting with other modular systems in your head that have different jobs, and these modules can have different beliefs, they can have different preferences, and of course, eventually you act as a unitary whole. It's not like people are being literally pulled in different directions, although with some disorders you are literally being pulled in different directions, but the normal human being is not. And somehow these fights amongst modules get resolved, and how that happens is very interesting. But I want to just now start trying to say a little bit about how all of this comes together and explains why everyone except for you is a hypocrite. One of the places that you have to start looking is, of course, in morality. And what I've been doing over the last few years in collaboration with some of my students is thinking a little bit about morality. And when I think about it, I always think about it in the same way that you would try to figure out what it is that a particular application in an iPhone is doing, by looking at its properties, how it works, what's it doing, what's it up to. And so when we've been thinking about morality, the way we've been kind of conceptualizing it is that and I don't necessarily want to persuade you of this, I just ask you to sort of entertain this for the purpose of this little conversation that we're having. It looks like you have little modular systems in your head, and what they do is they identify certain things that other people are up to, and they condemn them for doing it, and that you try to get people punished for doing those things. Right? We call these a little moralistic module. Right? So people, and if you don't want to think about yourself, think about your kids. If you have kids and when they were 2, 3 years old, just try to recall what it was like when they were going around, and pretty much it seemed for a little time at least as though all they did was identify when someone had committed some moral violation and then tattle to the teacher or an adult or so on, right? And even if you try to extinguish this behavior, don't tattle on Jenny, right? It's not nice. Most of the research in developmental psychology says that in contrast to what one would expect from a kind of behaviorist model where you can punish something and extinguish it, you can't make it stop, right? So the little moralistic machines. And what I would argue is that as adults, we're like this too. I'm not going to cast aspersions about your recent opportunity out here to stop moralistically condemning people from smoking certain things from particular plants that have a particular chemical in them. But I would say a majority of voters in this state apparently think that it's a good idea to continue to moralistically condemn and punish individuals who choose to inhale these particular products. And as a psychologist, I feel comfortable saying we don't actually know why that is. We don't know why you guys care so much about other people token up and getting stoned in the privacy of their own home. I'm not standing up here on a pro-drug thing. That's not my point. My point is that we don't know why people care so much, why people have modules that are designed to put their boot on other people's heads. And we do this all the time. Now, more or less in various kinds of places, right? All I need for the argument is that people are moralistic, that there's modules designed to cause other people to not do certain kinds of things. We call these things moral norms or moral rules and so on. On the other hand, coexisting with your moralistic modules, I want to argue, are modules that are designed to cause you to behave in the world, to make choices, to do whatever it is you're going to do. So my argument here is that at the very same time, you can have a module in your head that is designed to stop other people from doing X for a wide variety of X's, depending on culture and time and so on. And yet, you have other modular systems in your head that drive you towards doing X for, again, a wide variety of X's. Now, if we didn't have modular minds, you could imagine that there were mechanisms in your head that homogenized our behavior so that you couldn't both condemn X and do X. I do a little thought experiment when I'm trying to get this across. I always use Commander Data from Star Trek, which I suppose just says more about me than maybe I'd care to divulge, but he's a good example. If you want to have somebody else, you can imagine that whenever Commander Data is about to say something is wrong, he pulls out a tricord or something like that, and he just figures out, right? He looks at his list of things that are not okay. You know, LaForge, it would be wrong of you to point that phaser at Captain Picard and press the stun button or whatever it is, right? And that would be wrong. And then when he himself is going to do that behavior, I wonder if I should point my phaser at Captain Picard and pull the stun button or whatever it is, he wouldn't do it, right? You could imagine that the same principles are guiding behavior and condemnation. What I want to argue in humans is that because of the modular architecture, that doesn't seem to be the case. So in the visual version of this presentation, I show this really nice picture. You can see it on Failblog, where you have an individual who I think quite appropriately has these bumper stickers on the back of their truck. And it says, I can read it here, cars don't kill people, people driving while on their cell phone kill people, or something to that effect. Don't, be on the phone while you're driving. And then it's a great shot because you can see into the cabin of the truck and the guy's on a cell phone, right? And so there is nothing, you can think of that bumper sticker, if you will, as his sort of moralistic modules doing what they're going to do, condemning other people's behavior, and then his own behavior is unconstrained by it. And because we're modular creatures, because we have these different systems separately condemning and acting, driven by different modular systems, you can get these contradictions. And so what I want to conclude with is the answer that I pose in the title, which is why it seems like everyone else is a hypocrite. And in order to get there, I want to tell the little story, which some of you have probably heard, about the two people who are out camping in the woods and they see a bear. And one of them starts to put his sneakers on. And the guy says to them, and he's like, yeah, some of you already know it. He says, look, you can't outrun a bear. It's a bear. There's no point in putting your sneakers on. And the first guy says, I'm not going to try. I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. And the idea here is that, yeah, other people notice inconsistencies. That definitely happens. We're on the lookout for other people's hypocrisies. But the world is complicated. And we don't always remember what people say. Not everyone was around. We have limited memories and so on. It's true that it's a cost to be perceived as an inconsistent person, right? But you can be just as inconsistent as the guy who's in the joke about the bear, right? I don't have to be perfectly consistent. I just have to be as consistent as possible so that you don't notice that I haven't been, right? So I just have to run away from you. I don't have to run away from perfect consistency. And what that means is that if it's true that I might sometimes notice my own inconsistencies and leak it in the same way that Will Bailey, as the press secretary in the West Wing, might have leaked it, I'm actually better off not noticing when I'm inconsistent, right? Not having an inconsistency detector such that if I myself have identified this piece of inconsistent behavior, I can give myself a strategic advantage, minimizing the probability that other people in the social world are going to be able to identify this inconsistency and hold it against me. Because it is true that people seem not to like hypocrites, and why that is actually a little bit more complicated than at least had thought it was. But the take-home message is that if you look at the research on bias and research such as the one that I mentioned about the college instructors, is that people are pretty biased. But the neat thing is that people think everyone else is even more biased than they are. And my argument is that this has to do, ultimately, with evolution and the modular mind. Thank you for your attention.
I wonder if you had some thoughts about, I think we've all seen in the past few years a lot of instances of some of our public officials who like to espouse one type of public morality and then practice another private morality. And maybe it's part of the same thing, or I don't know if it's a different question, of sort of some people seem to have a greater need to tell others how to live their lives than other people do. And I don't know if it's different parts of the same, or sides of the same coin, or what.
I don't want to go easy on the politicians here. But having said that, there's a funny thing about politicians, which is that unlike most other people, one, what you say tends to get written down or recorded these days, either on YouTube or whatever, on a cell phone or something like that. And two, part of being a politician means taking a stand on the stuff you don't like. I would argue, I want to be delicate here because I hate politicians as much as the next guy, and I'm not trying to give him a free ride, but when I'm a hypocrite, right, it's probably because I morally condemned something, but it's pretty unlikely that the New York Times reported on that a few years ago. You know, Rob says, you know, whatever, X is bad. I'm sure I haven't actually done anything that would have violated my own principles, obviously not. But what I'm trying to say is that there's something funny about politicians is that they're public, which means that their condemnation is recorded. And second, they tend to have to take positions on what they don't like. And so if you take those two things together, it's really easy to identify hypocrisy in the modern world, because in cases in which you have individuals who are on the record as having condemned stuff. So for the definition of hypocrisy I use, and I'm willing to grant that you can have a different definition, it's condemning X and doing X. How many times are we going around the world being on the record as condemning X? So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say, which is a really interesting question, we've just started doing a little bit of work on this, is that, you know, it just seems like some people are more moralistic than others. Some people just like to put their boot on other people's head more than other people do. And I think California, again, I don't want to keep getting back to this coastal thing, but you know, to a large extent, this is a pretty permissive state. I mean, the fact that I can buy wine in a grocery store here is just brilliant, compared to Philadelphia, where I have to go to a state-owned liquor store, right, during their hours, paying their prices for their supply. It drives me crazy, right? So, you know, that's a case where you have this kind of legacy of a moralistic attitude towards this particular. By the way, here I am, alcohol, drugs. I'm not Mr. Drug Guy. Just good examples. So I guess what I would say is that one of the things we don't really understand, let me put it this way, if we knew what morality was for, why people are trying to stop other people from doing stuff, then we would have better insight into the individual differences. Now, speaking of drugs, and I might as well go all the way here, sex, right? I have a paper with a couple of collaborators, Jason Whedon, that came out last year in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, in which we do go after your question. So what we show is that people who are opposed to the use of recreational drugs also tend to be the people who are opposed to sexual promiscuity. And so what we're trying to do is link individual differences and we have a theory about why that should be, and now we've replicated it in Japan and Belgium. If you know what morality is for, then you can try to figure out where the variance is going to be in terms of individual differences. And we're just starting to build that theory right now, but it's a fantastic question.
Professor, you talk about modules and so on. You never ever mention peer review. You talk about everything else but. May I ask your comments on that?
If I had to take a position on it, I'm in favor. So I'm certainly pro peer review. I mean, if you mean literally the institution of peer review, I could wax about that for quite a long period of time. I would say that from my point of view, I think of peer review in the same way was it Churchill talked about democracy, where it's this horrible system whose only virtue is that it's better than all the others. And I think there's something to that. I guess what I would say is not much deeper than that, which is that peer review is an important part of the scientific process, and I certainly endorse it. I think one of the things that's happening right now with the movement of information is that the review process is being, to some extent, externalized into the world. So people are publishing papers in Nature. Within 3 weeks, the blogosphere erupts and identifies all these problems with papers, which I think is actually great. I actually think that we're going to be better off. It's just not organized.
I have a question regarding the information age that we've come into, and with regards to the duplicity you're talking about. As recording of information and the recall is becoming so much easier, do you think this duplicity, I mean, speaking of what he said earlier, how in the campaign earlier in 2008, John McCain, or actually most of the older politicians are finding it harder to change their positions on subjects and stuff, and I was wondering if you think with the advent of all these technologies and the recall that makes that possible with conversations and you know just positions that people can take, do you think the duplicitous nature of people will disappear over time?
Resist the notion of duplicity to some extent only because it implies intent that I don't always think is there. So I think people, whatever it means to sincerely believe something at time one and then sincerely believe its opposite at time two, I actually think that there is a sense in which, and I'm holding aside the notion of actually changing positions, which is another possibility. All I want to say is that duplicity, I think, is slightly stronger than I would say. But there's a weaker form of your question that I think is really interesting, which is related, which is something like, are people going to exert more effort to be consistent and coherent over time, given the fact that there are these externalized memory systems? That, I think, is totally true. What surprises me in some sense is that people aren't doing a very good job of this. As you indicated, you have some politicians who are quite, at least in my opinion, they flip in these very funny ways, presumably knowing, at least I think, or maybe not, that they're on the record the other way somewhere in the past. So I guess what I would say is that, I take a strong view on this. I mean, I think human nature is human nature. I do think, of course, it's flexible and it depends on the cultural context and technologies and tools that are around us. So I do think people are going to change a little bit. Having said that, it also, there's this other edge to that sword, which is that with all the information, all the recording of stuff out there, there's a kind of a signal-to-noise ratio problem. I mean, the fact that not only can I find out what John McCain's position was, but I can also find out what my next door neighbor's dog barked like 3 years ago. I mean, all of that is not my neighbor, whatever. I'm just saying there's all this information out there, and it's true, it's fairly well organized, all things considered, but still there is a possibility that information gets lost not because it's not recorded, but because it's in the mix. But I think that's a totally reasonable possibility that consistency will increase over time.
And I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little more about the research you're doing on moralistic punishment.
One of the things that we've been looking at, and thanks for the question, is this kind of interesting tension that there is. So on the one hand, people are highly moralistic in the sense that they're very quick to identify other people's shortcomings. On the other hand, people don't actually seem to be willing to endure many costs to impose costs on other people. And we've run some experiments in which we show that if A and B interact and I'm a third party of the transaction and I have an opportunity to punish A for doing something bad to B, and this is a gross oversimplification, by and large, I don't do it. I'd rather not get involved. I'd rather not endure the cost. So on the one hand, you have people who are very quick to identify other people's moral failings. On the other hand, they don't enforce moral rules. And again, since I'm in a media environment, I just want to make one plug. We're actually trying to do some research bringing together data from a television show called What Would You Do?, which has vignettes in which something bad happens, and then the question is, do people intervene? And it's an incredibly rich source of data asking this question about the probability that people are going to intervene, conditional on observing some moral failing on the part of a third party or a second party, however you want to think about it. And what we're doing right now with that data set is trying to identify what factors influence intervention. But my reading of that, and I know that this might not be a popular view, and I say that given what's going on in the scholarly literature, my reading is that people are not particularly strong interventionalists. That is, they notice and they condemn acts, but they themselves don't impose costs on them, at least in the cultures that I've been looking at, and we're trying to do some replication. So that's one of the directions that we're taking the work. But thank you.
How would you position within the hypocritical system a George W. versus a Obama?
So I'd like to return to the beginning of the question, which was about my productivity, which I want to thank you for, and to remind people who might not have remembered. Having already stuck my neck out on liquor sales and drug use, and I guess I mentioned sex in there, I am going to respectfully decline to draw comparisons. But I will say, and this connects to a previous question, again, with politicians, let me put it this way. There's a reason these guys go into politics. And I don't necessarily want to say that, something that is so broad that it doesn't leave room for the notion that there's obviously, people who are of, let's say, particularly strong moral fiber, as it were, or let's just say consistent in the context of this conversation. But I will say that I'm completely sympathetic to the frustration that people who are on of any political stripe. And again, just beg your indulgence on easing off the specific question that you've asked.
Question is, we're coming on to what would be Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. And in many ways, you can look back on his career in politics and see a through line of hypocrisy. And my real question is, do people care less now that politicians in particular, but in general, that people are hypocritical, and that do they just are people more compassionate in attributing that to simply the human condition, and with also the possibility that people evolve and see things from a different point of view?
The current context that we have in this country is a two-party system. And people in those parties have a lot to gain by supporting their candidate, their particular party, and so on, independent of their failings in many cases, up until it gets to some particular level at which there's sort of a populist rule. At least that's my perception. What that says to me is that people on one particular side of the aisle, when they're evaluating the consistencies of the people who are at the front of their particular political parties, are likely to be sympathetic, not because they're sympathetic to inconsistencies in general, but because of the same reason that I identified here, which is that it's in their interest to overlook inconsistencies of the people who lead their parties in particular. What I'm saying is that, yes, people are inconsistent about the enforcement of inconsistency, right? So when my guy is inconsistent, well, the world changed a little bit. When your guy's inconsistent, he's a hypocrite. And I think that's the flavor of the political dialogue. I don't read the polity in this country as being more sympathetic, more empathic to the notion of human foibles. If anything, I read it the other way. It's just that you don't hear it from within the party, you hear it from without.
I have a question, I guess, about the role of religion or cultural pressures to conform or to have certain beliefs, where the rigidity of a certain kind of system, I wonder whether it results in a difference in terms of hypocrisy or inconsistency because people aren't free to actually think.
One thing that we've been looking at a little bit, and this is some work with my former graduate student, Peter Tscholi, is the kind of puzzling link between religion and what I would call these moralistic systems. You know, for some reason, which I think some people think is obvious, but I don't, maybe I'm just not as quick as other people, there seems to be this relationship between organized religions and lots of rules about what you can't do or what you get punished for doing, either now or in the afterlife if you believe in one. And that's a really interesting question. I don't believe that has been answered to at least to my satisfaction. So what I would say is I wouldn't put it necessarily in the context of inflexibility, because I think I wouldn't want to go quite that far in terms of the claim, although I'm perfectly willing to be persuaded. But I wouldn't necessarily stipulate that without additional persuasion. But what I would say is that a really interesting feature of religion is that in virtue of being members of organized religions, you sacrifice your ability to do a set of items on pain of punishment by that particular group or set of institutions, many of which are puzzling. I mean, so you go back and you look at, the charging of interest, right? The fact that that's moralized, which makes basically everyone worse off, right? You have money, I want to, start a business. It's harder for both of us, right? You can't make money by using your capital. I can't start my business. Why is that bound up with religion? Why should religion as a supernatural collective, as a social phenomenon, be concerned with economic transactions, particularly economic transactions that make people better off? So I think if we answered that question, why does religion care about stopping you from doing all sorts of things, we'd come really close to getting to the deeper question that you're asking.
Talk a little bit about the role of the press challenging politicians and religious leaders with respect to hypocrisy.
How it is that the advent of recording devices has changed people's ability to be inconsistent without anyone noticing. And so I think, one of the things that I think is great is how the producers or whoever it is that works on the show, I don't really know how television works, on things like the Colbert Report and the Jon Stewart one, where these guys can literally just find clips of people saying the reverse of the thing. And I think that's an incredibly valuable service. And I think what that's telling us is something about connecting up to this previous question about how careful people are going to have to be in the future to make sure they know what they said, particularly in the context not just of what it is they're going to say tomorrow, but what they're going to do tomorrow, right? So the example that I often use is Spitzer. That was kind of an obvious case, right? You can't get up in front of the state of New York and say, I'm going to go after the prostitution rings and I'm going to bring integrity to the office, and then, And so I think in those cases the press has an easy job. But again, I do want to say that it's not obvious to me that identifying inconsistencies is necessarily going to do the trick insofar as people are willing to forgive inconsistencies when their interest is tied up and bound to the interests of the political leaders of their particular party or political group.
I want to come back to this press secretary metaphor that you had earlier. And it's often best that the press secretary not know everything. And I think a good example of that would be, I think his name was Scott McClellan, the second press secretary under Bush. Half the time it looked like he didn't know what was going on and was sweating a lot when asked tough questions. Or he's a very good actor, I'm not sure. So that metaphor with what you were talking about with the mind, our press secretaries, our modular press secretaries sort of don't know what the rest of our minds know. But sometimes we do get in trouble where we maybe endorse something and then we're caught doing the same thing. Do you have any experiments or do you know of any work where when people are then sort of, you mentioned it a little bit with the drivers who got into an accident, but if you sort of push people on, hey, you just committed this violation, how does their press secretary, how do they then talk about it in these experiments?
One of the things that's interesting about this literature is that everyone sort of just assumes that appearing inconsistent is a bad thing, and so by virtue of that assumption, no one's really looked into it in much depth. I would just say a couple things. There's a student of Dan Sperber, who is an anthropologist in France, named Hugo Mercier, who has begun to do some research into this. That's one entry point into the literature. But the short answer to your question is that, people, so in the pantyhose case, people are very it's very easy for people to spin a story about why they chose those particular pantyhoses. The world is complicated, and my sense in the context of explaining one's own inconsistency is that people tend to bring in lots of different possible reasons for it. So, the usual one is, look, the world has changed. When I said the prostitution was bad, that was a different world. We really had to stop prostitution back then. When I availed myself of their services, it wasn't as big of a problem. Now, that, of course, wasn't his defense, but you could imagine defenses of that type. Of course, people can say, I changed my view, right? So I think that, again, I would go back to the bears. As long as my argument can twist you up enough so that you can't detect the fact that I'm continuously being inconsistent, then it seems to me that all I need to do to win that social game is stay just ahead of your ability to detect the flaws in these styles of arguments. And I think that's what one sees. You see this in politicians and you see it in everyday life. Maybe this is my own experience, but certainly in the context of my relationship, I may or may not have had to dig for reasons why it was that, having said that we shouldn't do X, I later said that maybe we should. And I think that people are pretty good at developing these narratives. You can develop narratives about all kinds of crazy different things, even if those facts don't bear out in the world, as long as your interlocutor can't identify that fact. But I think that there's an area in which the research at this point is still more or less in its infancy. The fact that we don't really know just how bad it is to be perceived as an inconsistent individual, I think, is a symptom of the larger picture here, which is that there's still a lot of work to be done.